Welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello and welcome to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. My name is Barry Schwenk. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host as we explore the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. Over the last couple of months, I've had the privilege of having Dr. Rob Goodman join me here on the podcast as we have been discussing well-being. For many of us, we struggle with this idea of having balance in our lives. And hopefully over the last few months, as we've been talking about this, you understand that we're never actually balanced. We're always in the act of balancing. And there were five main domains of well-being that we have been discussing and kind of breaking apart. And hopefully, as we have been discussing each of these domains, you have gained a little bit of insight to help you, to encourage you to continue down that path of finding health and well-being in the many different aspects of your life. So today, I think are we on number 4, Rob?
We're on number 4 already.
We're on number 4 already. My, how time flies when you're talking well-being, I guess. So I appreciate you coming back. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you. How are things going in your neck of the woods?
We are going well. Talking vocational well-being, it's always interesting to think about the things that you do. And I was an Army officer, a veterinarian, a pastor, and now have taken over the family ranch. And so I'm adding rancher to the things that I do. And so rainfall is always a wonderful thing. And so we've had a very wet spring, grass is green, cows are fat. It's good. Makes you feel smart when it rains.
Nothing's better than that. Yeah, we wish you could take credit for it. That would be look how well Rob's doing. His grass is green.
It is interesting that you say that. And part of our, we're talking vocational well-being, but we conflate so much of our identity with the things that we do.
Right.
Sometimes that's a job, that's a profession. Sometimes it is vocation, but we also take so much blame or so much credit for things that we have nothing to do with.
Yes.
This time last year, there wasn't rain and everything was brown and dry. And I was thinking, man, I'm such a failure.
Yep.
And so there's part of this vocational well-being that is simply figuring out, one, what does success look like?
Right.
How do I measure my obedience to God's calling? And it's probably not with my job title. It's probably not with how much money I make. It may not even be with the outcome. I think about Isaiah and God says, I need to send somebody. And Isaiah says, oh, send me. And God says, I'm going to send you, you're going to speak, and nobody's going to listen.
Yes.
And so, that vocational side, our success is really measured in our obedience and not in our outcomes. And I think for many of us, that's really hard culturally to, and sometimes even organizationally, whether it's in a clinic, in a nonprofit, in a church, the things that we count are the things that we think truly count.
Right.
And it's sometimes hard to see, pastorally, if I have one person that finds hope and understands how loved they are, that's so much better than 300 people that are just sitting there like a lump. But sometimes it's much more encouraging to see a whole bunch of people than to hear that one.
Well, and it's interesting. When we've talked about let's see, physical well-being, relational well-being, and emotional well-being, when we get to this topic of vocational well-being, our standards change a lot. And that measuring stick, you are absolutely correct. And I think an awful lot within my own context, a lot of my relational well-being is not my fault. right? It's my wife's fault, or it's my client's fault, or my emotional well-being is my parents' fault. But when it comes to vocational well-being, I bear this burden of, like you said, I live and die by the sword, and take an awful lot of credit for green grass when I really shouldn't. How do we so let's start here. What exactly, and we've talked about vocation quite a bit. What exactly is vocation, and how do we define it so that way we can approach it appropriately?
Yeah, it's defined a number of ways, and unfortunately for many of us growing up in our generation, vocation was shop class. Is where the kids that weren't going to college went. And if we move even farther back, kind of Middle Ages, pre-Reformation, vocation was a calling to religious orders. So a calling, either you had a vocation and you went to the monastery, or you were just a lay person. And so it is important that we say, wow, what do we mean when we say this? And so I look at it that the job is what I do to get paid, and a career is a progression of jobs, hopefully with increased responsibility and increased pay. A profession is really a set of training and standards and a group that monitors that internally. So the profession of veterinary medicine, we have a degree, we have a licensing board, we have a professional association. But vocation is what God calls us to do and what God calls us to be, and it transcends all of that. And both you and I have had multiple jobs and truly multiple professions,
Yes.
as both veterinarians and as ministers. And there are times that people look at me and say, well, why are you wasting your degree?
Yeah.
Because I actually have registered for the last 3 years. My state licensure is inactive. And so I can't prescribe things. I can't legally diagnose things. I think I can still use doctor in front of my name. I haven't paid my dues to ACVIM. And so even though I was at one time board certified, I can no longer call myself board certified. And so there are a lot of things that profession wise that could really challenge me. Because oftentimes we conflate our identity with our profession. Right. We do that even, as we introduce ourselves. Hi, I'm Rob Goodman. Hi, I'm Father Rob. I'm Dr. Rob. I'm, a veterinarian. I'm a pastor. I'm a rancher. I don't know what I'm doing today. For a number of years, I'm Jennifer's husband, was the way that people knew me. And so, but, our identity at the core is beloved. Our identity is beloved child of God. And our vocation, the way that God has called us to be, is the way we live out and into the fullness of who God has made us to be. You're probably the same way. There are times that passages of scripture just kind of stick with you for a while. And recently, the call narratives of the prophets have been a place that I kind of go back to. And I love the way that Jeremiah is called, and God speaks to Jeremiah and says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were even born, I consecrated you." And I think those are pretty much statements of how God interacts with all people. He knows us as he is forming us in the womb, and he consecrates us to be his holy ones. And then God continues, "And I appointed you a prophet to the nations." And it's that appointed piece that is our vocation. I have called you to be this within my kingdom work. And I think we spend all of our lives figuring out the fullness of that. Sometimes we have more of a grasp on that than other times, but it's a kind of a back and forth, a prayerful back and forth with God, kind of figuring out how he is calling us to live out who he has called us to be in our identity as beloved.
Well, and I think for at various points in time in my life, and I think for a lot of people who are listening, that we conflate calling an appointment as being the same thing. And that's one reason why so many of us struggle. I had a hard time making there was a season in my life where I wasn't practicing, and I really struggled. I really struggled with that. Because a lot of my identity was wrapped up in my appointment. And I would think that as we talk about vocational well-being, I think you hit it when you said, if we first understand the calling of beloved and then move into those places of appointment, which may change over, I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, kids around here call me Dr. Pastor Coach Barry, because I've got all these different hats, and depending on where you see me, I'm wearing a different hat. Understanding that those appointments may be wide and varied. How do you get to that place? Because for me, that was a real struggle separating. And for most veterinarians, a lot of people, even if you go to vet school right now, everyone will say, I am called to be a veterinarian, as opposed to I am called to be beloved and appointed to serve as a veterinarian. How do you begin to separate those things?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we are forced to separate that is that probably at some point in time, all of us are going to change appointments. Whether that's, I spent 20 years in the Army, and so I changed jobs every 2 to 3 years. Was still a veterinarian, was still an officer in the United States Army, but I couldn't get too tied to the job or the job title that I had. And so there was a blessing to that. But when I retired, I didn't know who I was. And I think for veterinarians that have been practice owners and they sell their practice and they retire, there's a struggle with, okay, I've invested myself in my identity in being a veterinarian. Who am I now? I think on the flip side of that, when we invest our identity in what we are doing, when we confuse, as you say, our calling with our appointment, oftentimes we struggle with imposter syndrome. I was young and cocky enough as a veterinarian that I don't know that I ever struggled with it as a veterinarian. I did in my residency, but as a pastor, I struggled a lot with. I was older and probably experienced enough to know humility and my own limits, and faced with my own limits, it's like, I'm not sure I can do this. But I think that finding that thing that transcends us, and in some traditions that people call that a life verse, discovering your life verse. For me, it was in looking back and saying, oh, I've done all of these things. What are their commonalities? And then kind of as I'm pondering that, God has a funny way of putting scripture before us. And I swear that he changes things. I was reading through the Bible in a year. I was on a reading plan. And as I'm pondering all this, I'm coming into Luke's gospel and Zechariah's prophecy over John the Baptist. And I mean, as a liturgical guy, it's something you say every morning at morning prayer. It's one of the canticles. So I'd read it over and over and over. And then that portion where Zechariah says over John, he's saying, you're going to lead the way for Jesus, and the dawn from on high will be upon us to bring light to people who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. And I recognized in myself that desire really from the point of wanting to be a veterinarian. I wanted to be a veterinarian because my old dog, I was 12, and my dog ended up with idiopathic vestibular syndrome, and we took her to the veterinarian. Our family vet said, this happens to old dogs sometimes, and we don't know why. And I said, I'm going to know why. I'm going to bring light to this darkness. Yeah, I did. Years later, did a residency in internal medicine.
I want to write that down real quick. What'd you figure out?
No, well, I didn't. I learned a new word for it. And so when we don't know things, we make up big words. So, fortunately, theologians are beyond that, but as scientists, we do. And so I learned idiopathic, and it's like, oh, there are things that I can't know. But by then, I was starting to see, wow, this desire to bring light to people that sit in darkness, whether it's in the profession of veterinary medicine, in my military career, clergy or another group that oftentimes have a large degree of darkness that they keep hidden. And the agricultural professions are the same. And so I've just started to see that kind of distilled down into my own life, to say, okay, in these things that I am doing, as I step back and look, particularly when I get over busy, to say, okay, in what way is this bringing light where there is darkness and the shadow of death? And so that's been my way of starting to wrestle with this. I don't think that I don't think we ever have all the answer,
right?
Of exactly what God has called us to be in the fullness of His kingdom vision. But I think to recognize how God is calling us, how God is, as my spiritual director said, how is God wooing you this week? That call to come and be awakened to something. Much like Moses, who knows how many times he walked past that bush,
right?
And on that particular day, he said, I'm gonna go see this because it's something that's unusual, and that's where God met him.
Yeah. Well, and it's always been for me, and this is something again is probably not unique to me. I think it's pretty consistent within the veterinary profession, because of how strongly we feel towards those gifts that God has given us and the skills that He's given to us. But I keep going back to the first chapter of Psalms, or to Jeremiah 17, where the psalmist kind of paints that image of a tree being planted by a river, because in those places where I'm struggling vocationally, whether it's with imposter syndrome, whether it is with time balance, whether it's disproportionate focus, whatever it is, I always have to ask myself, like, where am I putting my roots down? Where am I looking for my satisfaction? Where am I looking for my identity? Because in those moments of not knowing, in those moments of darkness, where you can't quite see how things are going to fall, and how are things going to land, I think that if your roots are well planted in Christ, that He can still allow fruit to come to bear. So how do you, let's say that for someone right now, because as folks are listening to this, what would be some hallmarks in your mind of someone who is really struggling with vocational well-being? What kind of things might they be seeing in their life right now that says, this is not where you're supposed to be?
Interestingly, my own story of well-being comes out of a place of deep vocational unwell-being. And I remember that truly the darkest time of my life was paradoxically when I realized that I'd succeeded in everything that I'd set out to do. And so I wanted to be a veterinarian since I was 12. I had gone into the Army. I'd finished a residency. I was commanding the unit that I wanted, and it was the time when you had to look at what's next. And I'm like, there's nothing else I want to do, and there's nothing else I want to do. And so when vocation is I focused rather than God focused, it may hum along a little bit, but it has no roots. It's just blown about. And so, I mean, recognizing, the other really interesting thing that sticks in my mind vocationally, very early in my career, I first job out of vet school, and in charge of a unit in the swamps of Louisiana, and my mouth was far more Army than church. And I told the guys in my unit, hey, we need to finish up early because I got to go to a thing at church tonight. And one of my privates looked at me and said, sir, you go to church? And so I think when we recognize that disconnect between who we are in our workplace and who God calls us to be, we recognize that as we're unloving to others. God calls us to be loving. When we're unloving, there's something that's disconnected. When we're unmerciful, when we're unfaithful, when we're asked to do things that bear false witness, any of those things, those disconnects between how we behave in our workplace and who we are called to be are signs of that vocational unwell-being. And I mean, as a liturgical guy, reading heady theological stuff, a phrase hit me that our liturgy connects our ontology to our teleology.
Yeah.
And so my wife says, tell me that in English.
Yeah.
The things that we do, the ways that we pattern our days and our lives, connect the stuff of our being, our identity, to what is at the end, our teleology, what we are becoming. And so paradoxically, who we are and what we're becoming is beloved.
Right.
We're growing into that. But the things that we do each day, the habits that we have, are the things that connect that belovedness and manifest that in our life. And so we spend at least a third of our waking hours doing our jobs. We work an 8-hour day and sleep an 8-hour night, we're probably not a veterinarian. But if we look at that, a third of our time and most of our creative, productive time is actually spent in our workplace. And so if that's not connecting us to our belovedness in God, there's a disconnect and an unwell being in us.
That's a big portion of time. If you just said, well, this probably is way too honest. So my wife and I have been married for 22 years now. We've only really had two really big disagreements or conversations. Let's call them that. One happened within the first 2 years of our marriage. One happened in the last year or so of our marriage. And they all revolved around work disconnect. It all had everything to do with, when you're spending a third of your time, or in some of our cases, when we're struggling with workaholic tendencies, it's more than that. That well-being, that lack of well-being spills over, and you talked very early on about those domains. If I am so out of balance within my vocation, there's no way that I will ever get close to being balanced within my relational well-being or my physical well-being. Or you get so far down that road, because again, for me, it's looking for, there's so much of my identity that's wrapped up in what I do that I have to do it perfectly, and I have to do it all the time. And when I put that weight on myself, I'm no longer God's beloved. I want to be everyone else's beloved. And when I'm searching for that praise from man, I'm going to get my reward, and it's certainly not as good as what God has in store. So I understand. So how do you, what would be the process? So for folks that are finding themselves really challenged in this area of understanding calling an appointment, and how do you then begin to make that change into a place of better balance? And then how do you ensure that that continues?
I'm going to take that in two parts. So
Yep.
here's part one. Remind me to come back to part two.
Okay.
Um, so part one is really in that conversational piece. So if I'm a supervisor helping someone younger kind of walk into this, or even if I'm trying to walk through it and I want to do it in a journal, there are three questions that really help. One is, what have I loved doing this week?
Hmm.
Again, as we look at what we truly have loved doing, where what we're doing resonates with something deep inside of us, oftentimes as we dig into that, we find that's where we're encountering the work of God as well. And so, what have I loved doing? What have I loathed doing? And then, what help do I need? And those are just fantastic questions to journal with. They're fantastic questions to, you know, the one meetings with subordinates. As you start to discuss those questions, you start to see the patterns emerge of what you love doing, and what you really don't like doing. You start to see, wow, God has called me into this type of work. He has, called me in this appointment. He has called me to execute kingdom work in this way. Usually around the loves that we have, and that's always controversial. One one day, the do you have a list of PhD topics? When I do my
I
PhD,
do.
this is what I'm going to
I
research.
do. That's horrible. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of mine's immunology, one of mine's the gut microbiome, but theologically, one of mine is to really look at the way Paul uses sarx and soma differently, the
Mm,
flesh and the body,
right.
and we tend to think of those. I mean, in English we use those interchangeably, but I think they're very different scripturally. Between, the desires of the flesh are not what we talk about when I really love doing this. It's really the desires of the heart that we're called to follow. As the psalmist says, delight yourself in the Lord, he will give to you desires for your heart.
Mm,
And so those heart level desires of, man, I really felt alive when I did this.
mm,
As we start to look at those and see patterns in those, we start to be able to discern, wow, this is where God is calling me to be. And then oftentimes as we're in scripture, as we're in the community of God, we see affirmations of that as well. The scriptures that resonate with us, the people who say, have you ever really thought about doing this?
mm,
Yeah, I remember, exploring my calling to the priesthood. I was very happy being a vocational deacon,
mm,
and never had any desire to be a priest. But as I started looking at the things that
mm,
the ideas that resonated with me of what I wanted to do within this larger vocation of bringing light to those who sit in darkness, I started to say, there are things that priests do that would be important in that. And I brought it up to kind of the circle of clergy within our little area, and the consensus was, well, what took you long enough? The people around us see how God is working, and oftentimes are there to give us those affirmations.
mm,
Sometimes even when we're not ready to hear them,
mm,
but we kind of treasure those away as well.
mm.
So that's the first way. One, to look at what's going on um, in your life. The other, similarly, as you were talking about um, your story, um, I was doing this and I was doing this and I was doing this. When we start to talk about our day and we notice a whole bunch of eyes in there, we've probably focused on a different story than the one God is calling us to. Heard an interesting discussion a couple of weeks ago, and it's one of those that, people, you've been wrestling with someone, and then people put a comment to it. It's like, that's exactly what I was thinking. Why didn't I have those words? That basically that before, in pre-modern culture, the center of the story that people told were centered around the family, the clan, the village, the god, either small g or capital G. And in modernity, our stories are centered around ourselves. And so vocational well-being comes about when God is the center of the story, and I'm able to recognize my important role in the supporting cast, and to be able to look around and see the grand story that God is telling, and recognizing the largeness of God and the smallness of self in that, but also recognizing the very important piece of that God has called me individually into, that God has called you individually into, as supporting characters in his great story.
There's no I in vocation.
There is, because it's an island.
Never mind. Maybe that's
No.
Well, I appreciate this conversation. This is, again, as we've been going through these different domains, this is one that I think will resonate with a lot of folks. And I look forward to chatting about that fifth and final domain of spiritual well-being with you next time. If you are listening and you are struggling in this particular area, you are certainly not alone. And hopefully, as you've been listening to Dr. Rob share, you can begin to understand that difference of who you are as being called as God's beloved versus the place where he has appointed you for a season to be his beloved. And that can make a big difference if we approach everything that we do within our job, within our profession, within our career, within our families, within our relationships. If we recognize that first and foremost, we are his beloved, and everything after that is to follow that position that we hold, that he's placed us in. So when we begin to live like we are beloved, then we begin to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you are blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.